I'm Nikki Jovicic from LookUpStrata, and I'm also Managing Director of Tower Body Corporate, a strata management company on the Gold Coast. For today's WA webinar, we're joined by Wal Dobrow from Reserve Fund Plans. In this webinar, we're talking about understanding and recognising risks in your building. As a lot owner, what are you responsible or liable for? By providing some really great examples, Wal will be talking about practical measures to reduce risks and hopefully eliminate hazards. What are the three buckets of strata safety, and what has the new WHS legislation got to do with all of this? With the help of some case law, Wal's here to let us know. Following the presentation, we have some questions. But before we begin, as always, I'd like to mention that the information contained in the session, including the discussions that arise from submitted questions, is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as legal advice, and you should seek independent advice before acting on the information contained in today's session. Okay, so today we're joined by Wal Dobrow from Reserve Fund Plans. Wal is a specialist in risk, safety and negligence. He has a Cert 4 in WHS, all 4 asbestos qualifications, and his companies have produced tens of thousands of safety reports and asbestos reports for strata and community properties throughout Australia. Over 85% of strata managers in WA utilise his services. He has made numerous presentations on the topics of safety, WHS and strata compliance, particularly identifying the risk of harm to people or potential damages to property from a common law duty of care, civil liability and a WHS legislative requirement. He wrote the Common Property Memorandum, which provides clarity and resolves many issues dealing with the repair, maintenance and renewal of a service or an area within a strata scheme, and which has been adopted into the New South Wales legislation. And he also wrote the Risk Management Module for all SCA strata managers licensing in SCA for Fair Trading's mandatory CPD training in 2020 to 21. Now, this is the third time Wal has joined us for a webinar. Way back in September 2021, Wal helped our audience navigate through COVID-19 plans for strata buildings during those early, rapidly changing times. I'm going to leave you with Wal now to start his presentation. I'll be participating in the chat, so you'll see me sort of popping some comments and communicating with you in that area, and then I'll join you later on and we can cover some questions. So welcome, Wal. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Nikki, and welcome to everybody. A very, very important topic. I can see people logging in through there. Quite a few clients have come on board, and I've noticed some people from New South Wales as well. So the topic I'm presenting today will cover other states, not just purely WA itself. I'll go onto the screen, save and share first. I'll just bring that up. How does that look from your side, Nikki?
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks, Wal. That's great.
Okay, that's great. All right, the areas I want to cover for you. I'll just bring this down, bear with me. There we go. Understanding the difference between hazards and risks. I'm going to provide practical steps to reduce risk in your schemes, and more particularly looking at WA in some of the physical aspects that I've encountered in certain buildings. Control measures, they're simply things you put in place to reduce or eliminate a risk. Dealing with particular hazards. I use a term 3 buckets, and that'll become a little bit clearer earlier on, because some people will argue and say, oh, well, we're not really covered by WHS legislation. Yeah, okay, well, you'll be then tipped into the civil liability bucket. And then there's other things there. People say, what about additional handrails and the like? Where does that fit in? Well, that's the 3rd bucket. And then more importantly, and I get asked this quite a bit, where is the legal line drawn in relation to getting sued or not getting sued? And that's a very grey area for a few people. So I'm going to talk about the legislation. I'm then going to talk about the case law I have for you that gives a bit of assistance to that particular exercise. So the first point to look at is for owners have unlimited liability in their schemes. It's no different to me owning property. I also have unlimited liability. How do I minimise that? I can do that a number of ways, identifying hazards. I can get insurance, but not all the times you can rely on insurance, particularly if you have been reckless in particular ways. And even if you do put some measures in place, it doesn't mean that it doesn't stop anyone from wanting to have a go at suing you for negligence. Hazards and risks, and I will cover through this presentation fairly quickly. There's a lot to cover. So difference between a hazard and a risk. A hazard example would be something like uneven stairs. The risk is that someone will trip and fall and hurt themselves. A hazard might be large surf. The risk is that someone inexperienced may drown. The hazard is broken glass on the ground. The risk is that someone might trip, fall, and injure themselves on that broken glass. I hear some people overlapping the words between hazards and risks. So you identify hazards, then the inherent risks attaching to those particular hazards, and then you either remove the hazard or you reduce or remove the risk attaching to that hazard. Two types of key hazards and areas that we look at is property damage and personal injury. Building side, there's risks that we have when we look at the building side. There's risks dealing with maintenance, failing to maintain, which might have an impact on whether you get insurance or not, or higher premiums, which then ties and deals and then leads into the financial aspects and a financial risk. Not everyone has unlimited funds, and that's why that becomes a risk for some particular schemes. I'm then going to talk about the physical side. So your typical trip, slip, fall hazards, which then leads into the legal risks, and then obviously they're the financial risks if you're not covered by insurance and the like. There are other risks there dealing with property, such as your fire, mechanical failure, security systems, mainly for deterrent and recording purposes, traffic pedestrian conflicts, and that's an important one. People tend to fail to understand those things exist. Practical steps, I'll go straight into it. These are some of the things that I've identified and reasonably consistently throughout the schemes in WA. People failing to seal elevated walkways. We've heard about the Champlain Towers with the reinforcement steel corroding, no longer providing the support. And I see on some of these schemes, people forever painting underneath these walkways and balcony areas. But as I've got on the bottom left corner, you fix the cause, not the symptoms. So no point painting underneath if you haven't sealed the upper surface, and that becomes very important. Water blasting and silicon sealing. Now, it's not just a matter of removing the mold or discoloration on walls and the like, but what you'll find, your water blast looks great for a few months and then mold will come back. The step here is silicon sealing. And you'll find some water blasting people go, what do I need to do that for? And a bit reluctant to, because how can they live it themselves? They'll end up getting 2 or 3 more jobs out of something that might only be the one job. So that is in a preventative maintenance sense, not only for the aesthetics, but also as a safety aspect and keeping the mold away. As you can see that example on the bottom right-hand corner, the mouldy stairs. There's other issues with those stairs. You could probably identify yourself, where's the handrail? If it is slippery, what do you grab hold of? And in that particular circumstance, the safety net scheme, I'd say, put in 2 handrails. We see fretting mortar and brickwork. That is the transfer of moisture and salts through that material. How do you prevent that? There's cheaper options. Obviously, the builders and bricklayers like the more expensive option of pulling it down stuff again. But using a product like a Bondcrete or some sort of moisture preventative and topical, with a little bit of absorption, will prevent the loss of moisture, loss of mortar, and assist with the slowing down of the corrosion of this material. One of my bugbears, internal downpipes. You could virtually drive through a lot of areas in Perth and look up and you see the discoloration of the eaves area caused by having internal downpipes that corrode, leak water into that eaves and the soffit area, and then that leads to either rotting of the timber supports or corrosion of and rusting of the metal supports. So what do? In our 10-year plans, we provide an allowance there to convert the internal downpipes to an external downpipe, so that if the pipe does fail, you don't have water leaking into the eaves and soffit area. Control measures, very, very important. This is what we call the hierarchy of control measures. It's probably a little bit technical, but I thought I'd put in anyway. And primarily, this is the process. If you can eliminate the hazard, you're eliminating the risk. And down at the bottom there, you've got personal protective equipment. So, and one of the options there, you might put people in sumo suits to walk around on your property and with helmets on. That might provide a degree of safety there, Nikki, but at the end of the day, it's impractical. So you want to put cost-effective and practical solutions in, and on the right-hand side, in the hierarchy order, physically remove the hazard, as I mentioned before, replace the hazard. And what I mean by that is, rather than people walking a particular location, you might get them to walk around that particular location. Isolate people from the hazard. We see that on a regular basis. We're putting barriers up and the like. Administrative controls, that's very important because that deals with signage. That deals with giving people safety reports. That deals with highlighting steps and warning of that danger. And then down the bottom, they say that it's least effective. It's not quite correct because in some circumstance, the personal protective equipment dealing with a hazard is could be the first element. That is, if it's a butcher doing cutting meat, his PPE of a chainmail stainless glove is the first place you go because you can't eliminate the substitute engineer controls that administer it. It's the PPE is critical. But typically for our buildings and the like, elimination, substitution, and engineering controls is primary. And the examples I've got down the bottom there of control measures, we typically put in place a non-slip finishes, and that includes mats in wet weather, physical barriers, signage. We get insurance to provide a degree of risk mitigation. We highlight hazards checklists for going around and inspecting the property. You've also got to put in easy mechanisms to report hazards. That's to the committee, not to the strata manager, and let owners, in a way, look after their own schemes. If you can encourage them to do their, if they want to do annual checks, if they do want to take those personal responsibility for that exercise. If not, they can leave it to professionals like us to do the inspections. And then obviously I say engage professional people for safety and asbestos reports. Okay, I've got a few examples coming up here. On the top left corner, I've got a single handrail. That may not be sufficient if you've got a class of resident there being elderly. And in that case, a single handrail is insufficient. So the example I've given is that 2 handrails is better. On the right-hand side, fixing issues sooner rather than later. And that's fairly obvious. Some people might say, well, we don't have the money. Well, a stitch in time, is there some way to minimise that effect of that hazard? If there is, put that in place. It may be, for example, filling in the holes of those gaps in that pavers on the top right-hand side before you actually replace and do a full cleanup. Stair nosings we all know about, highlight paint we know about. Down the bottom left, wet weather mats can be a plus and a minus in that they can hold water, and once the people wipe their feet over a while, it tends to then leave water in there and can be a hazard in itself, not only attracting water but as a trip hazard. So it's not the perfect solution. Physical barriers, we've seen those. That's the other point too. How many schemes have some of these things sitting around they can easily get hold of? If it's necessary, where's your wet weather mats? Where is your barriers in case you need those? Obviously, it might be a quick trip up to a hardware store. Pedestrian traffic conflicts. I always find this interesting because it's something that tends to grow on people that live in a scheme. We've always driven out and they don't think, oh, hang on a minute, what if a skateboarder comes across at speed or someone's jogging or something similar? And the problem you have is where you have fencing that's a little bit higher than 1.2 metres, then you can't see pedestrians coming from your left or right. And obviously the control measure is to put in a mirror so you can not only see people coming, but those people can see the car coming as well. The pot plants on balconies in some areas, some circumstances, not so much in the examples I've given here, but if they're secure, that's great. But I have seen circumstances where people balance pot plants on the edge of the balustrades and think that that's okay, and it's obviously not. The joke sign there on the right-hand side, caution, this sign has sharp edges. Do not touch the sign. Gets people thinking about the sign. And I think underneath it says also the bridge is out ahead. So signage, it tends to attract people's attention. Tripping hazard, slippery when wet's important. Now, I haven't listed this particular case, but what I like about signage, there's a case in the High Court called Dedera versus RTA. Young guy dived off a bridge in northern New South Wales, hit the rock, sued everybody, must be their fault. He said RTA should put appropriate measures in place. The High Court decision said, well, there's 2 steps. One is, was the risk reasonably foreseeable? It said, people have been jumping off the bridge 40 years. No one's been injured, but we do have this person before us. So the answer is yes, but a small yes. What is the appropriate measure? Is the appropriate measure on that bridge to put in tall fencing and crushed glass on the top and other barriers? Or for that small amount of risk, was it appropriate simply to put up signage, a nomogram, the red circle with the stripe through it, say no diving? The High Court said that was the appropriate measure for that amount of risk. And that's why I like signage, because that case supports that measure. So when we say, I'll put signage in, we had one scheme that said, this is in Sydney, people are getting up on the roof and throwing beer cans down when they're watching fireworks. Are we at risk? Yes, because you know about it. Or what do? I've got one of our inspectors, ComCareX, sent him, and one of those measures, we're putting signage up and obviously barriers and the like, and using the dead of a case. 3 buckets of safety I mentioned earlier. This always remains a civil liability, and in WA we have the Occupiers Liability Act. The principles very much the same, keeping the property safe from harm to any person. WHS came in 31 March of this year. And what I say about the right thing to do, there is nowhere, for example, in either the civil liability or WHS legislation that says you've got to have visible street numbers. But if one of your family members is having a heart attack and you're waiting for the ambulance to try and find you, it's probably a good idea to have those there. So where does that fit in? The second handrail is a good example as well. That's really not set up or steered towards the civil liability or WH legislation, but it's the right thing to do. Same like chaining furniture and other objects away from the pool fence so kids don't drag it across, climb over the fence, and an injury occurs. Legal side. We have the existing Civil Liability Act. There are 3 key elements of the Civil Liability Act. Section 5B was a risk not insignificant, what the reasonable person would have done, and more particularly what you knew or ought to have known. There are a lot of people there in the illustration I've shown there. You can't put your head in the sand, because what that does from an anatomy point of view tends to expose that other part that you don't want to do. So you want to address things that not only that you knew, but ought to have known. It's no good saying, yes, we knew the balustrade handrail with a bit of a fall, there was rusting, but no one gave us an official report in it, so therefore we're somehow protected. You're not protected. But the court will look through all that and say, was it something that you ought to have known? Yes. Well, it's no different as if you knew. So that's one of the 3 key principles. And the point there, our owners already have unlimited liability. WHS, the 2 new pieces of legislation. What does it mean for lot owners? More reports, more checklists, more evidence of compliance. So it's not enough just to get a report, it's also to act on those recommendations. So owners, got there at the bottom, get safety and asbestos reports. Now it's getting a little bit technical here, so sorry about that, being a technical type of person, but I think it's important for people to know the definition of workplace, in essence, is any place where a worker goes or is likely to be for work. And that could be a vessel, it could be above or below water surfaces, rather than just a typical, I don't know, building in essence. So what does that mean? As soon as a worker turns up on site, that becomes a workplace, then other persons under Section 29 of the Act have duties, and those duties are to ensure that they take reasonable care for their own safety, that they ensure that their acts and omissions do not adversely affect the health and safety of other persons. So it's a bit like an example I give. If the guys in the street are digging a trench, that's their workplace. I can't go there and move their barriers or jump a hole, because I'll get prosecuted under the work health and safety legislation as other persons. So again, get safety and asbestos reports as a reinforcement, because as soon as a contractor turns up on site, you have duties as other persons, being the council owners, strata companies, lot owners, and visitors under that work health and safety legislation. Asbestos, briefly going to talk about that. The relevant date is the 31st of December 2003. That was when asbestos was banned for use in Australia. There are some properties that have evidence beyond that date, and for whatever reason have asbestos materials there, but typically 2003 and earlier, go and get an asbestos register. That way you're taking steps, reasonable steps, to show that the property is safe, or we've put control measures in place to assist any visitor, residents and contractors, that the workplace is reasonably safe. And if there's areas that it's not safe, then the measures for them to put in place to be safe for themselves and take reasonable care for their own actions. Okay, I do get some arguments. Some people say, oh, we're exempted from the requirement under the work health and safety legislation to get asbestos registers and management plans. And say, for example, you won the argument, but your civil liability duty still remains. There's no good to say that on a thin edge up here, we can argue that residential premises, residential purposes only, there's an exemption. Good. As soon as the worker turns up and it's built prior to 2003, you need to provide an asbestos register. And if you think you're going to win that argument, you'll lose it on the civil liability bucket because you have a duty to warn of any dangers. And it's, as we say, asbestos is a known carcinogenic, hazardous material. The legislation also, I might add, asbestos doesn't have to be removed from a property when it's identified. It just has to be managed. It doesn't have to be tested, because the problem with testing, as you can imagine, some people think, oh, it's some invisible testing. It's not. It's physically breaking, snapping, drilling the material, releasing deadly fibres. Even though you might wet the area down, you've got your personal protective equipment on, and you seal the broken bits afterwards. It's still a dangerous practice simply to get the sample. And what you want to be able to do, and what the legislation allows, is that material could be assumed to be asbestos, and therefore you treat it as if it is asbestos. And the contractor dealing around it can follow the safe work practices. If it's not asbestos, it doesn't matter. If it is asbestos, it doesn't matter, because he's treated as if it is and puts the equipment on, keeps the area safe, plastic around, collects the dust, properly dispose off, and the rest. Fines if you get it wrong. I think on the body corporate on the right-hand side adds up to about $270,000 worth of fine. So there's things of not providing access to an asbestos register, not having one prepared and kept at the workplace. And it's easy from a practical point for strata managers, when they send contractors across to a workplace, they simply attach the safety report and attach the asbestos register, and that way they're meeting their duty under the work health and safety legislation. Fines generally, manslaughter laws, as people have heard, have come into being, and it's 20 years jail, $5 million in the highest level, the recklessness area. And as you can see through their body corp, it's a $10 million fine at the upper level if someone died as a result of reckless behaviour. 3.5, 1.8 and 570,000 at the least severe area. So where's the line drawn? And this is a pretty important part. And as I said, I get asked this quite a bit. And in a way, some people think it's a grey area. It's not that grey. I think it's pretty clear in my mind. And that's Section 5B, the Civil Liability Act we saw before, was a risk not insignificant what the reasonable person would otherwise do. And that then leads into 5C, is what the court is to consider. And primarily, as you can read on there, the probability of the harm, if care was not taken, the likely seriousness of the harm, the burden, which is really the cost of taking precautions to avoid the risk, and the social utility of the activity that creates the risk. So that sort of comes down to what I call the time, cost and trouble. And likewise, in the work health and safety legislation, they have a whole section on what they call it reasonably practicable. And that is in weighing up the likelihood of the hazard or the risk, or the person knows again, or ought to reasonably know, or reasonably to know about the hazard or risk, and the ways of eliminating or minimising the risk, availability suitable ways, and above all, it says there the cost associated with it, and whether the cost is disproportionate to the amount of risk. Example I'd like is, I've got a piece of machinery, it's likely to cut someone's finger, so therefore there's a risk there. But to minimise, eliminate that risk, I can put a big guard on. It's a lot of money, takes a lot of time. Every month I've got to strip the machine apart, takes extra 2 hours. It's a horrendous amount of money for that small amount of risk. As long as I record and document that, then I'll discharge that onus upon me. And that's where I think it's important to weigh up the time, cost and trouble. Okay, litmus test in all my readings, I like a particular Victorian case, and it says that the test of the reasonable person is not what comes up in cross-examination. That is, you don't have to be the smartest legal mind in the world to resolve all issues dealing with safety. For example, I'm a subject matter expert for surf life saving, and I reviewed in New South Wales their OHS policy, their later work health and safety policy, their safer surf clubs policy and processes, dumbed it down to a page and a half. My club says, oh, can you do the 3 monthly inspections? No, I'm not the reasonable person. If I go and do those inspections, you can't use anything electrical because you don't have RCDs in your circuits. You can't put any boats in the water because you don't have safety chains on the ATV. Go and find a normal, reasonable person, not me. I'm not that reasonable person, particularly in that circumstance. A couple of cases here for us. Pablis versus Wetherill Park Shopping Centre. What I like about this particular case is the leasing agent had evidence. He spoke to tenants every few months, any issues. And where the issues arose, he got them fixed. Some people said it gets slippery around the ATM when it's wet. Spoke to the owner. Owner said, go and get someone, fix it, go and put a non-slip finish on. And they did that. 6 months to the day after having that non-slip finish applied, Pavlis slipped over, sued for negligence, and basically saying they haven't done what the reasonable person otherwise would have done. The judge said, in essence, that they foresaw that risk and they acted upon it. They did everything that the reasonable person otherwise would have done. It did not matter that this non-slip finish didn't meet some friction test, which the engineers are arguing over, because the level of duty does not have to extend to the chemical knowledge of that particular product. It's just engage a professional, let them do their job, act on the recommendations, and that's it. And this, in a way, this is what I see as the nub of the advice that we provide. We provide safety reports and asbestos registers. You rely upon those reports. You follow the recommendations. You carry out the actions we recommend. We provide safety action plans for you that'll record the things you do then put in place. And that takes you over that line in relation to the negligence side. So again, using Pavlis, get a safety report. We recommend putting a barrier up somewhere. You put the barrier up there. And if someone was injured, then you're arguing to say, in essence, ultimately to the judge, what more can I do? I engaged a professional. I follow their recommendation, and that's it. That's my line drawn. This is a more recent case. This is in Victoria Court of Appeal. This dealt with a leasing agent that was engaged to do a property inspection, leased the property, tenant took over. A few days later, the tenant slipped over on the rear stairs. There were no handrails. The stairs were slippery, a light was out. And they argued about a whole variety of things, but ultimately the agent was found to be negligent for not carrying out a proper inspection because they were engaged to do so. To fix the stairs and put a handrail in, as you can see there, was $570. However, over $500,000 was awarded against the agency as a result of their failure to do what a normal person otherwise would have done, actually walk down those stairs and not just look at them from a distance as what that particular leasing agent had done. Wu versus Carter's a Strata case dealing with a defective balustrade. The leasing agent was found to be negligent because he didn't carry out a layman's push and pull test. So when they go through and do their inspection, in essence, what they should be doing is opening every cupboard door up to ensure that the cupboard is not going to fall and hurt someone. Likewise, with the balustrade, I know it sounds a little bit extended, but the court said he should have carried out layman's push and pull test. And as a result, he would have found out that the balustrade railing was defective in a way, and then he could have then advised the owners corporation to fix it. The court awarded 75% of the cost to the OC for failing to maintain common property, and 25% to the agent for not carrying that layman's push and pull test. Riddis is a New South Wales case. The importance of this particular case is that it comes out the principle there, as Justice McColl said, is that an occupier has not breached that duty of care by not inspecting their premise for the purpose of discovering unknown or unsuspected defects. And that's important. This was a case where the wind blew a front door shut. The Riddis put his hand up, cut his arm, sued for negligence and saying the OC should have repaired and maintained the common property to the extent they should have replaced the glass and should have somehow miraculously known that glass in a windy day could have broken, injured someone. And what I also like at this particular case is there's an obligation in Section 3 of the Act for New South Wales assessed to repair and maintain, which is a strict duty, wherein I've been told in WA it's not a strict duty to repair and maintain, it's still a duty. But in regards to safety, it imports an obligation of reasonableness, not absolute safety. So I think that's helpful. And the extent of OC to inspect the safety issues. Again, the owners are at liberty to do their own inspections, go through and identify hazards and put in measures they think appropriate. But we find a lot of owners don't want to take that personal responsibility, and in some schemes a little bit political. How come someone's found this thing but not something else, and choose not to do it and rather get someone independent to look at that. Okay, what have we learned? Understand the difference between hazards and risks. Practical steps to reduce property damage and personal risk. That's from the practical side. I think that's the important part. The control measures we spoke about, the 3 buckets, it's a good way to describe if it doesn't fit into one argument, doesn't fit in the other argument, maybe it's a third argument, which is just the right thing to do. And legally, where the risk line is drawn. So what do you do now? You get a safety report, get an asbestos register. The interesting part is, from my view, it's not a risk transfer exercise. It's just doing a prudency exercise on behalf of the owners. You engage a professional, they will look at things from their particular perspective, and then you put in appropriate measures for your particular scheme. And I do craft our reports to give the owners that latitude, because I'm not intimately familiar how many people go in that backyard, and if there's a trip hazard there, they might look at it and say it's nothing for our scheme, or they might say for our particular scheme, every Saturday and Sunday people are out there all the time, so it becomes a major issue for them for that particular trip hazard, and they can then decide for themselves what would then be the appropriate measure to put in place based on our recommendations. Record evidence of the steps, of the reasonable steps taken, and then obviously monitor and review. That's about me, Nikki.
Excellent. Thanks, Wal. That was great. It was nice and detailed, and I really liked the fact that you gave those examples and the photos. I think people can really relate to what's happening in their own scheme when they see the pictures of what's happening in other schemes as well.
No, that's good. And we've got some questions anywhere.
We have. Before we go into the questions, I just wanted to mention, I think when you were bringing up the 3 buckets, I had used that as a bit of a teaser when I sent the email out to everyone this morning to say what are the 3 buckets, and come along and we'll let you know. But one of them, I think the blue bucket, I really like that blue bucket with the right thing to do. And my husband's in mining, which is why we're over in WA anyway, but he's always talked about ownership. And when you see something, then you take ownership for it. So I guess that's kind of what I related to when you had that slide come up. And I guess if you're a lot owner that just happens to be walking around your scheme and you see something, what should you do if you're in that situation?
The scheme itself should put in place some mechanism to report that. Now, there are portals that people get involved with and exchange of information. Even if it might be as simple as some schemes, just ringing up the chairman or sending him a text or sending me a message, then the committee will decide what they want to do, because ultimately they're the collective mind of that owners corporation or strata company, and they will then engage through the strata manager, the appropriate contractor, to address and put the appropriate control measure in for their particular scheme. As you can see, I do talk about particular schemes. It's not up for me to dictate. I'm just there to facilitate. And it's important for some schemes to say you might have the same trip hazard in the front and the back, but as I said, no one goes in the back, so it's not as relevant for them. But in the front, they might say, hey, we've got a lot of elderly people in here, and even though we've got that trip hazard there, we think we should be putting in more handrails. Oh, that's a great point. Let's put in more handrails, because your particular scheme, and you know these people better, that would address that issue in that front of the property.
Excellent, thanks. And the other thing the other comment I wanted to make is over the years, we've received so many questions in from schemes all around Australia about lighting and not having adequate lighting in entries and exits to car parks, and also in common areas, so that overnight when people are walking around, they actually can't see adequately. And there might be, the lighting it's been out for the last 6 months and the community knows it's out, but they haven't done anything to replace it or to fix any of the issues, and just the exposure that places the building in.
You're 100% right in that regard. It's a foreseeable risk. It's not, and that's that ostrich head in the sand type approach. Oh, we don't have money, we've got an excuse, we're entitled, we've got some other issue. Oh, I found a reason why we can't do it, or whatever else. Just go and do it. You go to one of the hardware stores. For $13, you buy solar lighting. There's not a difficult exercise. Or I like the gutter lighting, so we make recommendations of those in areas, because some people say, oh, hey man, we've got to get an electrician in, we've got to dig up the asphalt, we've got to put conduits, all around the place. It can be thousands of dollars. No, you put in gutter solar lights. That's not hard. They're high enough up there that someone's not going to walk around with a ladder to try and steal them. They're $20, $30 each. You put it sufficient enough up in there, and then the ones that do die over 6 months or so, just replace those. But it's an easy fix in terms of lighting. The other thing I might say is, in terms of where people walk, if there is a noticeable trip hazard, the highlight paint is helpful, even if it's white, low light, you'll be able to see, oh, hey, there's a change in area here. I've got to go and do something. Yes.
Okay, that's a good tip, actually. Yeah, I like that one. So that's nice and practical, and it's fairly easy to do. And if a light happens to go out at some point, then at least they've got the white line still there until you get somebody in to actually quickly fix the issue with it. So yeah, that's a good one. Thank you. Okay, so we had a couple of questions that were submitted. We might jump into those first. The first one was from Natalie, and she was saying, we have a retaining wall that's cracked and does not meet Australian standards. It took 20 months and a SAT application to get a $750 report confirming my suspicions. The cost to fix the retaining wall is just under $30,000, but we have no bank account, let alone money put away to fix the issue. The other three owners who control the strata are stalling. One of our lot owners say that if a problem is identified, including a major issue like this, we just need to be seen to be doing something. They claim this is part of the Strata Titles Act 1985. Is this true? And if a problem is identified and insurance says no to providing liability insurance to cover the problem, is there a time frame to fix the problem?
I think the biggest problem they have is the insurance side. The insurers we're finding are very selective. They've been beaten up with the bushfires, with the flooding, the cyclones. They're being very selective of who they choose. They're asking a lot of questions in relation to, do you have asbestos? Do you have any known defects? Do you have any other problems in that regard? And it's not so much of, I will pay a little bit more in additional premium. The issue is you won't get insurance. And then you're fully exposed. I went back to my first point. Owners have unlimited liability. I think in this particular case, it's a matter of looking at what risk lays with that damaged retaining wall. Is it likely almost to fall? And if so, if there's no one there, well, what's it matter? If you put a reasonable barrier up there to stop kids and other people going there, particularly kids, because they like climbing on things that, about to fall. So you want to put a physical barrier there, not just a little bit of warning tape on a stick. And that might be an appropriate measure to protect that area. And that'd be probably the first thing I'd be looking at putting in place. It doesn't matter where you're looking at, they say, oh, it's Australian standard, doesn't meet Australian standard. That's not the point. That's a fallback position if it's not known of how to put an appropriate measure in place. And there was a recent case in New South Wales dealing with a low height balustrade, and the tribunal was left with the decision to say, well, what's an appropriate measure? And someone put their hand up and said, well, the Australian standard says 1 metre and no footholds between 150 and 760 for kids. Okay, well, yeah, all right, let's do that. We'll apply that as an appropriate safety measure for that risk. It's not a retrospective building reconstruction and bring things up to the current standard. So that is a bit of a backdrop. So when they say, oh, it doesn't meet the Australian standard, yeah, so what? The question is it a likely and foreseeable risk of harm to an individual or damage to property? If it is, then how do I address that? Is it putting some supports, which you've seen, push them in the ground, put your your supports there to hold the wall up from falling over further? Or if there's plenty of room around that area, just help it collapse. What's it going to do from there? If it doesn't do anything other than gets rid of the heavy brickwork or whatever else might be holding it there, that might minimise that risk or eliminate the risk of falling on someone. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And that case that you mentioned about the balustrade in New South Wales, well, we do have an article on the LookUpStrata site on that too. I think Mueller's had written it, JS Mueller and Co lawyers. So I might share the link to that below the recording so people can check up on that and have a read of it as well if they're interested. So thank you for that. And just talking about insurance and problems with getting insurance, we did have a question that came in chat actually, but fairly soon after we started the session, from Joshua, just asking, I'm an owner of a strata unit in Perth. We have an asbestos roof. We can't find an insurer to insure the building due specifically to the asbestos roof. We're trying to replace the roof, but it's not a quick process, especially at the moment. Do you have any suggestions for us to try and get insurance? If we can't get insured, what is the risk to owners?
Okay, the simple answer on that is, for properties that I have, I get rid of the asbestos. And I think I'm fortunate that I know the right people at the right price. They don't take shortcuts and get rid of that. The roof asbestos is just going to get worse. Your difficulty is going to be finding material. You're not going to get colourblind roofing at the local store or click your fingers. It's going to be months and months, if not years, before you get the replacement material. So what you're left with is doing an analysis of the risk of that particular property. The insurer's risk primarily is if the place burns down, they have a whole big pile of contaminated rubble to get rid of. They don't have a whole pile of hard material that they can separate when they're doing the demolition and put it through a jaw crusher and then create material, aggregate material and others. So it becomes a very high cost just getting rid of it at the high rate for asbestos. So what they're left with is, unfortunately or fortunately, is simply to manage that on site. So they need to get an asbestos register. Asbestos management plan will typically say leave in place, do not disturb, and replace when appropriate. And the appropriate is broad enough to say when we have materials available and when we have the contractors available to remove. It's not a difficult, insurmountable exercise. There's been quite a few asbestos roofs that I've come across that have been replaced. I'm not saying it's an easy exercise, but it's not an insurmountable exercise. So, for example, I know I'm going slightly long on here, the risk may be that the roof is starting to shed fibres. So what's the control measure there? And people out there looking, think, well, what would I otherwise do? How do you stop the fibres from separating and then contaminating gutters and everywhere else? It's just a matter of painting it. It's not, you'll never ever blast. There's a good case just recently in Queensland. Some painter went on the roof. We'll tidy this asbestos roof up, hit it with a water blaster. $43,000 later, $100,000 fine, and all the soil all the way around in the adjoining properties had to get dug out to about a foot deep, carted away at that extraordinary cost. They're crazy. On one property I had Super 6 roof, starting to get a little bit flaky in a way, and it was just simple a matter of enamel paint across the top, and that was just roll it in, and that provided a binding for the fibres, and that was a reasonable control measure, I felt. So similar for these people, if the issue on the roof is not just that it's asbestos, but you're starting to shed fibres, well, you need to put a sealant on there of some sort, some paint. It's ugly as it is, it's not a tidy exercise. Pouring paint on, let it all absorb in, and that will bind it, and that will, in a way, for the insurer at least, saying that's a reasonable control measure.
Okay, that's great. Well, hopefully that helps, Joshua. So, and then they should be able to provide to get insurance a bit easier if that's true, Wal, if they follow those steps. Hopefully,
yes, it'll never take away that they have asbestos. So, in a circumstance of complete destruction, but in relation to the contamination risk, that'll alleviate that hazard.
Excellent. Thank you. All right, that's good. And we might just jump back to one of the questions that was submitted previously again. So this one came in from Colson, and he's asked, we have a roller door to access our common area car park. Lot owners insist on having remote fobs for the car park access. On a few occasions, the roller door has been accidentally activated. The door has been closed onto vehicles and people, and it's been left open overnight. How can we make lot owners aware of the security and safety risks associated with the use of the fobs, so lot owners are responsible on common property?
Unfortunately, it's you've got administrative controls that go in there, the hierarchy of controls, putting notices out, putting warning signs up. I think the physical elements there is going and talking to the roller door contractors. Is there something I can put in place that typically it's built in the mechanism that when the roller door will come down and hit something and it finds resistance, it'll then trigger and then it'll open back up again. If it doesn't have that and wants to do a karate chop and keep going, then you need to talk to the expert on the roller door side and say, can we put that sort of mechanism in place? And typically, as you're probably aware, they have the reflective lights, a bit like when you walk into a shop and it makes the ding dong sound. Likewise, a car's gone past, now no longer a car, so the doors after a time will then close down. You can't help some residents, so you could write off and talk to them about security as much as you like, and some people don't care. And yes, you'll be banging your head against the wall, but by taking reasonable steps, and I keep going back to those points, and recording you've written off to people, you put some signage up. Ultimately, you want to get to a stage where you can say to a judge or a barrister be arguing and saying, what more could these people do? And a fair-minded person, in a judicial role, would say, well, yeah, you're right. What more could they do? They wrote off to everybody. They did this. They put signage up. They went to the specialists. They made sure the doors wouldn't karate chop people. And to a degree, whatever that foreseeable risk was then either eliminated or minimised.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And we've had some comments that have come in chat, so I'll just read through them. One came in from Tim saying, as an OC committee member, I had to push for 2 years to get edge strips on the common staircase. If someone had fallen during that time, would I equally bear responsibility, even though I raised the issue and pushed to get it done. It was $1,000 in cost at that point when they did get the repair done.
Okay, I'm not a lawyer, so as we said in the beginning, I can't give legal advice. I do read every negligence case in Australia, the major ones, every single day. I have done last 15 years sort of thing. Yes, I'm that person. I'm the guy that does that research and reads these things. You don't alleviate risk to you as a committee member just by saying I've raised it. You've actually got to go more, because again, it's the collective mind of the OC, and that's the committee, that's the council of owners who collectively have decided on something. Unfortunately or fortunately, whichever it goes, by being made aware of it, they have to address it. They can't just park it away and say we don't have enough money. They have to find the money and they have to fix it. They can't leave their property open. And when they get around the insurance side, they have to declare the issues they have. We have a perceived risk here of the carpet might be coming away and therefore there's risk on the stairs. You have to tell your insurer. Your insurer may decide not to cover you for that risk. And how cheap was it to get those things done? Was that like a coffee a week for three weeks or something, or a month for each of the owners? You know, you break those costs down. It's not $1,000. It's how many lots do we have? Oh, 20 lots. Okay, well, that's starting to bring it down to $50. It's $10 a week for 5 weeks. How's that insurmountable? You know, and remember I mentioned about the time, cost and trouble, about the amount of risk. So that and amount of cost, sorry, that becomes fairly relevant as well.
Okay, and there are, even if it's a fairly large amount of money, there are funding options available as well, aren't there? So it's not like you can turn around and say, well, we had no option, we didn't have any avenue. There are other avenues available. Yes,
correct. And that's what the court will raise as well and say, why don't you simply go and get a loan?
That's it.
Oh, because we didn't want to. Well, someone's now injured, and what's the saying? Murray Tobias said, you take your victim how you left him. So if your victim is left in a bad position, you have to bring them back to the position they were not otherwise in. So, you know, just get on and get it done.
That's it. Okay, and Ernest had a question that was, what is the legal responsibility on a service provider or supplier inspecting on site to make a note in reports on risk hazards they see? And do they carry liability if they do not report or note in their reports?
Perfect question. I really like that one. There's probably about 10, 15, nearly 20 items sort of popping out in my head straight away. The first one I'd say, that particular person coming on site, do they have professional indemnity insurance for the type of work they're doing? It's very hard to get professional indemnity insurance for asbestos. And we find that strata managers go, oh, do you have PI? Yeah, I've got PI. And they get conned by these people who go out there and they do safety reports, they do asbestos, they do other things there. But when you look at that particular policy, they're excluded from doing anything on asbestos. And this is one of the teaching points in New South Wales and the risk management module that was taught. And I had put in there, this is one of the risk transfer exercises. You as a strata manager have an obligation to ensure that, yes, it's got insurance, but does that insurance actually cover them for that particular type of work? And on top of that, are they current and competent in that type of work? And the example I give is, I don't make up something like a PEX2 type plastic that plumbers should be aware of. If it's a plumber, I've been a plumber 30 years, but are you aware of the material that you have to deal with in that particular scheme? If they're not, then they're not current or competent in that particular task, even though they might be a plumber. Now, does the risk transfer exercise come across? I don't believe it does. And the reason for that is that everyone's a product of their own training experience, and you can get a wide variation. I had some inspectors got all excited about roof anchors, and the other guys go, so what? Just because one person gets excited about a particular issue doesn't mean that everyone has to. So it's their own experience. That's why I said before, I'm not the reasonable person. I'm a different animal to that. So if someone went out and did the best they could and they may have missed something, well, okay, so what? It's still the liability, unlimited liability for the scheme. There was a case in Mona Vale where someone had slipped over and I had to do a peer review on a safety report, and having a look at it, so well, it's a matter of their judgment, having a look at that. And what time of the day did they go there? Was it dark? Was it wet for the time leading up? You're asking me to look at this thing, 8 months or 9 months later. Was it slippery in that location? I don't know. But he would have made a judgment and thought, no, there was no issue there, no hazard there. So I support that. And you can't go nitpicking and do the old post-mortem afterwards and saying, oh, well, they should have picked up all these things. No, it doesn't work that way. It picks up the majority of those hazards, and then the intended risks, and then whatever their experience is in that's the other issue. People don't carry out proper risk assessment. It's high risk, low risk. Well, that's not a measure between likelihood and consequence. You've got to go through those 3 steps and use that measure, not just throw a dart on the dartboard and say it's high risk. What's the likelihood of it? What's the consequence of it? What's the exposure like? And then from there, you've got a practical step to get to a reasoned conclusion and opinion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I must say to everybody, I have seen Wal's safety reports. Last time we met for coffee and a bit of a meal, he actually brought a few along for me to have a look at, and they are extremely detailed. There is so much information provided in them. I was really surprised to see the level of detail that are in those reports. So
can I say that it's not the scary detail? It's not something that you'll get in something. It's not one that people think, oh, if I get a safety report, then I've got to go spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. It's not that at all. This is why I sit on top of this tree and I read all these cases, so I know the appropriate measures to put in place. And there's things that you can look at and say, no, that might have a bit of foreseeable risk, but this minor measure you can put in, cost-effective measure, is sufficient enough. And then that way for the owners, they then have that level of protection. They've overstepped or stepped over that line and say, are we reasonably protected? Yes, we are. It's not one of, and I've seen so many reports where they try and bring buildings up to the current standards. Ridiculous, crazy. And putting in recommendations to go and get an independent fire audit on its 1960s 2-story walk-up. What are you talking about? They have no idea what they're doing. So this is one of the points. I've written an article recently. I said one of the points, if you have a sore toe, you don't go to a dentist, do you? So why would you go to, a builder or a quantity surveyor or an architect or someone for your asbestos registers or safety reports? Well, what do they technically know about safety? People get blind and think, oh, well, someone's put a quote in for this and they reckon they could do these safety reports. And I look at these things, I go, they're so deficient. And then we get asked, oh, can you compete against these guys? What, do you want me to do half a job? Sort of thing. So that's my, just a settling point for people to be aware of who is the right contractor. That's all.
And you also mentioned about the public liability and whether it's the right public liability. Well, should the strata manager be looking at that, or should the committee be looking at that when they turn up on site? Like, who should actually be checking to make sure that they've got the right public liability insurance for what they're doing?
Yep, it's a professional liability, and the professional that's okay. That's the professional liability side of it. That should be the strata manager. So it's not just a matter of a tick box. They have PI, yeah, we've got PI. No, you have to take the next step. Because if that was a question put to you, and that's where I used to live in the court system, if that was a question to you, would it be reasonable for a reasonable strata manager to do the next step and just ask for the policy and see if it's actually covered for that particular type of work? And I think the answer would come back resoundingly as yes. And if you polled or your other professional strata manager, everyone said, oh, yes, the majority. So what's that mean? It means that yes, you should have done the extra step, not just blindly listen to someone who's trying to get an extra job in there and say, oh yeah, we got PI. Yeah, but for that particular type of work. So it rests with the strata manager to do that extra step.
Okay, and we do have a lot of our audience that aren't managed by a strata management firm, so it would be the council's responsibility when they turn up on site to double check that information, or prior to turning up on site, or... Oh,
sorry, but prior to turning up on site. So typically, as you may be aware, when a strata manager look to engage contractors, they ask for their banking details, their qualifications, their insurances. It's at that point in time they say, can I look at your PI and are you covered for the type of work that you want to do? And that way, if they don't have PI for asbestos, they should have a separate area and say, these guys should not be doing asbestos for us or safety or whatever else they're not covered for. They may be saying, oh, we can do fire reports. Good on you. Where's it show you in your PI that you're covered for doing fire reports? Oh, we don't have that. Well, they shouldn't be doing that. It's not I don't believe it's the responsibility of the council owners to, before you walk on site, can you look at your PI, because the inspectors don't have in their back pocket the copy of the PI. That's an admin check done by the strata manager, who is then, in a way, recommending these contractors to come and do the work, or at least inviting them to put a tender in for providing quotes.
Okay, excellent. All right, well, thank you for that. And we've just about come up. I can't believe that hour always goes past so quickly, but we're just about to come up to the end of the hour. We always like to ask our guests, well, if you've got some news to share with us or something that you'd like to let our audience know. So if you've got something that you'd like to share with us.
Oh, it's a pretty high level in work health and safety, but yesterday there was a launch of what they call the Due Diligence Index for Safety. It'll become international. It was launched by Clyde & Co. Preeminent expert in work health and safety, environment and security is Michael Toomer, and Sydney, can't recall his surname, professor put this index together. But they have a new system. So typically larger corporations, as you know, directors are liable all the way through, officers, and the whole reporting side of things. But there is a couple of things that I did like, and there was one particular point that they came out and said one of the 3 tenets they have is safety as the presence of positives, not the absence of negatives. And to me, that resonated. So when you look at safety, it's not so much, oh, we've got absence of trip hazards, absence. Okay, but hang on a minute, where's your positives? So it's a shifting people's thoughts and saying, let's have a look at the positives. What elements do we have in place? How much have we engaged with our workers who are actually at the coalface to actually get them to make those recommendations? And that I thought was pretty important. They do say also safety is an ethical responsibility rather than a bureaucratic activity. And that was the other theme there. It's not a matter of ticking boxes. It's a matter of stopping and saying, can I protect Fred from the work he's doing? Is he going to go home safely that night or through the process we're putting him through? And people is the solution, not the problem. That were the 3 key tenets, Nikki, and they're very important.
That sounds great to me. I really like that positive aspect of it, to look at it from that positive point of view.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks all of you for your time and turning up and having listened. There is some very, very good stuff that I've presented, and I'd say that a lot of people don't understand what I'm talking about in some way, even though they try and compete with us and go, oh, it's all WHS, and they say, oh, they forget the civil liability stuff. So it's and thank you, Nikki, for the opportunity.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. Well, it was really great that you had the chance to come on. I hope that we tried to make it as practical as we possibly can. Wal and I had a bit of a chat about it, and we thought that would be a good way to do it. So we really wanted you to be able to walk away from the session with some practical ideas of ways that you can positively improve your building and make a positive difference in your building. So hopefully we have achieved that, and Wal's been able to provide you with that information. But thank you, Wal. We really appreciate your time, and you always deliver at such a high level. And so it was fantastic. And it's great that we'll be able to share the presentation with everyone too, and they can take it back to their other committee members or other lot owners in their buildings and use it as a talking point.
No, that's great. Thanks, Nikki. I might finally add to that the things that we put in or make recommendations for, I can always steer to a particular court case. Why did I put signage? I spoke to you about Dedera. Why did I recommend something or other? It's because of this court case. It's not just because I reckon. We back it up with court case, and I think that gives owners, and from the discussion here and the comments I can see coming up on chat, there to protect you. But it's a multi-layered there. It takes you ultimately to, if you did have an argument in court, what court case ultimately would be the one to support or save you from that pain and suffering of negligence and funding and the like. Cool.
And that's pulling it from all that information that you have up in your head from all of that reading that you do every day. And there's always something out there that's relevant. So we really appreciate that, because we don't want to go away and do all that. It's great that we can rely on you to go away and do all that for us and pull out the relevant bits that that make it relevant in the building. So thank you for that. That's wonderful.
Pleasure. Thanks, Nikki. Good to see you again, Nikki. Thanks for the opportunity.
Okay.
Great
Excellent.
to talk to everyone.
Thanks for joining us for this educational session. If you gained value from the information, please like this video. You can also engage further with LookUpStrata by subscribing to our YouTube channel or by being kept informed about Strata news via our regular newsletters. Our subscribe link is listed in the description box below.